Hello and welcome to Supporting English Learners' Success in the Math Classroom. Today we're going to be exploring math strategies. If you would like to follow along with us, you can go to the web address that's listed on here. It's bit.ly/supporting-ESL. My name is Kristen Adams and I'm a staff development facilitator at the Carbon Lehigh Intermediate Unit. If you have any questions or would like to gain any of the information, feel free to reach out to me at adamc@cliu.org. And joining us today is Kathy Schick. Welcome, Kathy.
Hi, thank you.
We are going to get started by looking at our objective for today, which is to utilize instructional strategies to support English learners in math instruction. We're going to go through some of the research behind math instruction, and then we're going to get right into some practical tips you can use in your classroom.
So I'll start this off with talking briefly about math as a universal language, because many of us believe that that is the case. Math is a universal language, and any student coming from any part of the world should not have problems in the math classroom. And as you can see, if that's true, solve this problem. And you can't, because unless you can speak this language. So just to point out that math is very, very vocabulary rich. So it is, the concepts may be universal, but not instruction and learning math. And if you want to continue, Kristen, I'll talk just briefly about even some symbols may also differ. So on the left would be more of a European way of writing the number 17. On the right is more of an American way. Students might have been taught to use a comma for a decimal or a division, maybe a colon. So keep in mind that math is not universal. And we'll keep going with that thinking and talk about math instruction around the world. In many countries, calculation is emphasized more than conceptual understanding. So students may not be used to having to show their work. They may be reluctant to do so. They may not have worked with manipulatives, so they think of them as toys or something that's not to be taken seriously. And certain skills like estimating may not have been taught. And finally, the scope and sequence of how the order in which they learned concepts may be different. So you may think if it's a 13-year-old English learner who just moved here from another country, they should know X, Y, and Z in math at this point in their education, but it may not have yet been taught, or it may have been taught much earlier. And very important is to know if your student was in an educational setting. If they were in a refugee camp, for example, then of course they'll have huge gaps that you'll need to identify. This is an example of how important vocabulary instruction is in math. Explicitly teach the words that you need, like percent and decimal, but also many of the words that we use in math have another meaning. So, I mean, we laugh at these kind of examples of kids taking a test. It says, find X, and the student wrote, here it is. But in a more serious way, this points out that for some students, they may know that the word find means to locate, but not understand that it can also mean to solve. So you have to teach those explicitly, your vocabulary and how words may be different, have different meanings.
So what we're going to get into next now is just some tips that you can use. There are 10 tips that we're going to share with you. And these all go back to that concept of, is math universal? And as Kathy already explained to us, some of our students haven't used manipulatives before, but it is a great way to solidify concepts for our students. So if you click into the bit.ly and that web address that we gave you at the beginning of this presentation, these are linked in here for you. There are tons of resources out there that can allow students, if you don't have the actual tangible manipulatives or you're doing it virtually, to have exposure and experience with these different concepts using a manipulative.
Yeah, and I just want to mention that building background knowledge is so important in math. This starts when you're lesson planning. So identifying potential confusions when you're lesson planning is the first step. And that may even be with word problems. I'll give an elementary example. So if the word problem says something about cowboys or on a ranch, that vocabulary, that background knowledge of what a ranch is may be missing for your ELs. Always use real world examples when you can to help build that background knowledge and connect learning to what students already know. We know that's the art of teaching, we build knowledge, we scaffold on things we already know. And using photographs and concrete examples always. So just a quick Google search and showing some images might be what it takes. And be aware of and pre-teach and explain cultural references. I just mentioned that with the cowboy and the ranch, but there was a study done many years ago about standardized tests and how many of the questions were culturally not familiar to students of poverty. And certainly that may be the same for English learners. So when you're talking about, something like golfing, our English learners may not know what we mean by that. So that's important to think about as you're planning how you could build background knowledge that may be missing. Our next tip is teacher talk versus student talk. So think about which you are. Are you the sage on the stage you are the expert who's giving all of the information, or are you the guide on the side and having students do most of the talking? This is especially important for our English learners because they need more time to talk, to listen to other people talk, and that happens with their peers. So are you providing a variety of ways for students to talk? Do you take time for think, pair, share, and for maybe peer teaching? Do you join in students' groups discussions? So when students are at a table and you have given them something to talk about, are you walking around and joining in and listening, clarifying, and so forth, not checking your email? Helping those conversations. And do you ask mostly open-ended questions? Do you give enough time for students to respond? Those are the kind of things that you really do want to think about in your instruction. If you are always the one in front talking, that minimizes your English learners' opportunities to build language development. Another tip is avoid asking an EL, do you understand? Because most often they will say yes, no matter what. It might be embarrassing for them to say they don't understand. It may just be that they don't want the attention of saying I don't understand. So simply saying, do you understand? Especially in a group, you can expect them to say yes, and they may not. So you might want to, in advance, privately with your English learners, have some sort of signal between the two of you that they can indicate if they need more clarification. So maybe if they give you like a quick thumbs up or thumbs down, or might even just be like an eye contact kind of thing, maybe making a C with their hand in front of their chest where I need clarification. But it's just a good way to have a safe environment for the EL that they can tell you, I need help.
So as we continue to tip 5, which is use scaffolding, these are some tips to help you to scaffold for students to allow them to have success. So creating a word bank when you're teaching a new concept gives students access to the words that they're going to need to use. And make sure when you're making a word bank, you don't add all of these words that they might not ever need to access, but just give them a few words that will help take them to the lesson and be able to have success where you're teaching them at that moment. Have them use sentence stems. Allow them to engage in the lesson by giving them an opportunity to answer a question, but by providing them that first part of the sentence stem allows them to get the sentence started, and it scaffolds them with that material. On the left-hand side, is a link that will take you right to an excellent website that allows you to look at sentence stems, and it gives you some math ones that would be useful in your math class. Don't underestimate the power of using images and visual patterns to allow students to understand the concepts that you're giving them. You could tailor the examples to meet the levels that they're at. And you can use websites such as the Khan Academy to allow them to have access to the concepts in their own language as well. The video that started playing, I embedded that in there for you to take a look at. We're not going to watch it today, but this woman who recorded the video did an excellent job on how to use word banks if you need more information on that.
And formative assessment, this is similarly going back to that silent signal. I'm sure you're using formative assessment in your instructional routine, but if you're not using it often, you may want to increase the use of it, because that is a great way. These informal, brief, low risk or low stake assessments that allows you to get the pulse of the room. Is everybody with me? Do they understand? Should I move on? Should I reteach? These can be really fun too. They can be done good old fashioned paper and pencil and entry tickets or exit tickets, or they can be done with all kinds of fun, Kahoot, Quizlets, fun ways to do that with devices. Think, pair, share is a quick way to do it as well. You're walking around listening to see what kids are saying. I like the pinch cards because they don't require anything other than a piece of paper and a pencil. So that's just when you ask kids to take a piece of paper and write yes or no. That would be done vertically. Or they can write 1, 2, 3, or if they're very young or younger, they can do smiley face, straight face, sad face. And then when you're asking questions throughout the class, they pinch whichever their answer is and hold that up. So you're looking around the room to see if they're pinching yes or if they're pinching no, meaning holding it at that place. The old-fashioned mini whiteboards still work. And a parking lot is an opportunity for kids to leave questions on Post-it notes at the end of a class or in the middle of a class. So think about if you're using formative assessment enough to get an understanding of where your kids are, all of your kids, but especially the ELs. And this is a video that's embedded here that was done by one of our colleagues on formative assessment. It's a very brief opportunity to just kind of brush up on that. Next, I think I'm talking about...
Yes, sorry, I'm getting to that one for
Okay, no,
you.
that's okay. I was just thinking,
tip number
that's
7.
okay. I was trying to get ahead of myself. Okay, so again, this may not be news to you, but just as a refresher, grouping your students is something to take a minute and think about when you have English learners. Of course, you'll want to know your English learners' levels, because if they're newcomers, you'll group differently than if they're high flyers and almost fluent. But in any case, consider your seating arrangements carefully. So we know that in math, kids should have plenty of opportunity to work in small groups and partners or in larger groups. So you want to make sure your classroom has some small group instruction area so that you can pull a group out and work with one group while the other groups are doing something. You want to use both heterogeneous grouping and homogeneous grouping. So homogeneous is when there's a skill that you're working on and all of them are struggling with this one skill. That would be a homogeneous group. They all have the similar problem or issue, but mix it up so that that you're not always grouping kids by ability. They pick up on that very quickly. Use peer translating partners sparingly. So it's very easy and sometimes very helpful to have a fluent let's say a fluent Spanish speaker helping other Spanish speakers, but we don't want to put any one student in that role too often without their permission, and even with their permission, because they probably wouldn't say no to you. But not every fluent speaker wants to act as a translator, and that doesn't always help the English learner who doesn't speak as well. So use that sparingly, only when needed. And of course, allow students to choose their partners sometimes. I think one of the most important things, two key pieces about groupings. First of all, teach kids ahead of time, whether it's at the beginning of the semester or if you frequently come back to it, what does it look like to work in a group? I've seen teachers even use the fishbowl where they model what it looks like when you're working in a group. What kind of questions do you ask people in your group? and maybe have a list of questions somewhere. What do we do? How do we keep the discussion going? What do we do if someone's not participating? So have some conversations about how do we work in groups? What does teamwork look like? By the way, employers tell us this is one of the things that they wish we did more of, was how to work in a team, not just putting them in teams. And then my other key to keep in mind with grouping is groups should always be fluid and short term. So you're not grouping kids for the whole semester or for the whole marking period. Kids should not get their identity from any one group. If you're as old as me, you remember reading groups long ago. Sometimes they had like bird names, and everybody in the class knew that if you were a cardinal, you were a struggling reader. Just that we want to avoid that identification through your group. So think about your groups. If you're not grouping kids, see if you can integrate more of that in a productive way.
As we continue to our next tip, it is to create supportive materials. And listed here are a few things that you can do. An interactive notebook is a great way to allow students to create their own meaning when using a specific concept that you're teaching. There are a whole host of interactive notebook examples. I linked one in here for you to take a look at. But giving students some of those scaffolds, as we talked about earlier, and giving them part of it and then allowing them to create their own meaning. As you can see in the image there are certain parts of the lesson that are already pre-cut out for them, some of that vocabulary, and then we're allowing students to create their own meaning as well. Vocabulary word walls are a great way to incorporate all of the vocabulary. You could do this digitally by creating a slide deck. And on that slide deck, you could put all of the vocabulary that is pertinent to the lesson. You could differentiate it as well and take out some of the words that you feel like if you have too many for a student to learn in one shot. Maybe you pick out the top 3 words they really need to understand for that lesson. And creating all types of images that you can use to support your students when they're learning is critical for them to have success in the math classroom. And these strategies will be good for any of your students in your room. Allowing students to create their own meaning is a great opportunity for them not only to be engaged in the lesson, but it helps you to check for understanding as well by looking at some of the things that they wrote in their interactive notebook and some of the words that they might be struggling with. You can spend some more time as a whole group going over the definition. This probably could be my number 1 tip if I were going to switch it, because creating a safe environment for our students to learn is critical for students to feel like they have not only a voice in the classroom, but they feel safe enough to voice it. So there are many ways that we can do this. You want to offer multiple modes of student participation. We want to group them, like Kathy said, strategically with different students. We don't always want to put the same students together in that same group. We want to limit the use of student translators, like she said before, by allowing students to not only be paired differently, but allow the students to also demonstrate their learning. So a student in your classroom could teach the entire classroom how to solve the problem. They can use manipulatives in the sentence structures and sentence frames that were listed on the slide before. You want to make sure that you establish your classroom routines, and along the same line, those things that you really value. And one of the things that I hope is part of your classroom routine is that we treat everyone in the room with respect and we listen to each other when we're talking. Those are things that we want to establish from day one and continue to check in, especially if we have a longer break or if you haven't seen your students for a while. I would start with going back and saying, this is what it looks like to be in our classroom. This is how we create a safe and learning environment for all students so that we are respecting each other and we're recognizing that we might not all know the same things and we might know things differently. So just because there's a lack of language doesn't mean that you don't understand the concept. Students can show it in their way, and just really valuing what each person brings to the classroom. One of the ways that you can do that is by making sure that you create wait time. It's really important to allow students to process the information at their way and in their own time. So for example, if you pose a question and then ask students to respond, some of your students that are really fast, quick thinkers might have their hand right up in the air right away. And a student that could take a little longer to process that information will automatically feel like, why am I going to answer? That student already knows the answer. I haven't even begun thinking about it. So one of the things that works really effectively in the classroom is if you say, ask a question and then say, I don't want anyone to raise their hand yet, and allow students to feel like it's safe to stop and think. We all need processing time. When we're going through these tips, we could have modeled for you as well the importance of wait time and stopping and having you write things down. It's a really important part to allow for students to think at their own level and realize that you might still be able to get the answer, even if you don't know it the first 10 seconds, like someone else in that classroom. And continue to provide supports for students and just valuing where they are at and letting them know that you're there to get them to that next level. The Would You Rather link in the right-hand corner is a great website. They have a ton of Would You Rather math questions. They're leveled by grade, and you could pose one of those questions. Would you rather, this one here is, would you rather make $50,000 per year? Or, and then it gives you those examples. But the most important thing is that you're creating that environment where students feel like it's safe to have a voice and to answer a question, and at times to get it wrong. And admitting to your students, oh, I made an error there, and then allowing them to help you resolve it is actually a great example for them to see that we're not going to be perfect in everything we do, and that's okay. And that's why we're here together in a safe environment. And tip number 10, our last one for today, is to really know your students. Each student comes with a different language level and different experiences. Like Kathy started in the beginning, some countries learn things in a different sequence. They might have different symbols and different ways to attack the problem, and that's okay. So creating those opportunities to allow students to not only express who they are, and this is just a fun find me out activity that you could tailor to any different way in your classroom and make it appropriate for high school as well, but just allow them to get to know each other and you to get to know them and realize really what are their strengths in math and how can we get them to the next level, because that's really our job, is to take our students from one level of where they are now to that next level.
Kristen, could I jump in there before you finish
Please
that one?
jump in.
I just was thinking about when I was an ESL teacher. I was in middle school, and I had a student come from Korea, and he spoke literally no English, but his parents did. He did learn very quickly, but he was so upset, we found out through his parents, because he thought that math would be the place he would just excel. And he didn't. He struggled because of the language for the first few months. But it just made me think about like knowing your student. Here was a kid who prided himself in his math ability. He thought math was his strong suit, which it probably was, but still he came with all this rich math background and math success, and he still struggled because of the language. So I don't know why, but this slide made me think of like kind of knowing that, maybe that could be one of the questions. If it isn't, how do you feel you're good at math, or how do you like math? What are you good at in math? Something like that. And I think this is important enough to have translated if you need to, or, work out with a translator.
Kathy, thank you so much for sharing that story. I mean, it is a crucial part of really developing that self-esteem and that confidence in math, is understanding where they are and where their confidence level is in math, because a lot of us come with our own baggage and background for working with math. Some of us might love math and this is great, and we're so excited to learn, and maybe they're coming into our classroom with that same enthusiasm and are going to be greeted with, oh my goodness, there's a lot of language I don't know, and feel inferior. But our job is to really start to point out to them all the things they do know, and think about the we to can do, what can a student do, and just having that philosophy in the back of our head when we're teaching is so important. So thank you so much for joining Kathy and I. Feel free to join us on any of our things that we're doing. We have an ESL networking here at the IU and a monthly newsletter. And reach out to me with anything that you have and any other concerns in terms of ESL. So thank you so much for joining us. All of our resources are listed on the last slide, and we hope that you found these tips not only useful, but you're going to start incorporating them or go back to some of the ones you haven't used for a while. Thanks again and have a great day.